Welcome to the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law weekly seminar series. We continue in week 3 with our postdoctoral fellow, Secular-Islamist, who works on comparative politics with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. He studies political parties, social policy, and democratic decline, and recently received his PhD from Harvard University. He'll be speaking today on his research about Tunisian political parties.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Secular-Islamist. As Didi also said, I recently received my PhD from Harvard, and my dissertation research was about why secular parties actually failed to form robust electoral alternatives to the Islamist parties in the region in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings and the popular uprisings. And today I'm going to give you one answer that I gave, which is the unequal political selection or the relatively negative selection of the secular parties face. And the case will be the first democratic local elections in Tunisia in 2018. So the survival of democracy in the region very much depends on the balance of power between the secular and Islamist organized political powers. Because when we see that the Islamist party is too successful, too powerful, actually we see some kind of like a democratic erosion, as we see in Turkey. Or if the secular forces are very powerful, but their power is not manifested in the political parties, we see a coup, as we see in Egypt in 2013, basically. But the secular parties were very much stuck in the middle level of votes, as opposed to the Islamists in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings and the Gezi uprisings in Turkey. But Tunisia was an exception. In Tunisia in 2014, the secular Nida party actually won the elections, both presidential elections and also the parliamentary plurality. And 2014 was actually a good time for Tunisian democratization because there was one big Islamist party and one big secular party, and they were like very distinct parties with distinguishable identities and platforms. And they were thought to be creating this new, stable, and competitive party system. But as you can see here, beginning from 2018, Nida Tunis, in the immediate aftermath of 2014, Nida Tunis started to decline, and in 2019 elections, it faced an abysmal result of only 2% of the votes. What I ask in today's presentation is what happened to the Tunisian party building in the aftermath of the 2014 elections. The next step for the Tunisian democratization was holding the first democratic local elections in 2018. You cannot see that there, but it is in 2018. It happened in 2018. And the first democratic local elections are very important for party expansion and candidate recruitment because the parties should bring in a high number of candidates to the party, and they should also expand their party organization to many new local branches. So there's a huge drive for candidate recruitment and party building, and this is a good opportunity to study political selection, basically. What I ask is, did the candidate recruitment and selection practices differ across the secular and Islamist divide? So did the secular party and the Islamist party have different candidate selection practices and outcomes, basically? During my fieldwork in Tunisia, I actually met with several surprising candidates within the Ennahda list. So they were considered to be surprising to be in the Ennahda list because they were like, for example, one of the candidates that I met with was a labor union activist in one of the northwestern parts of the country, and this is known to be a stronghold of the leftist movement in the country. And she was a very prominent labor union activist, and she told me even her children yelled at her when they knew that she was affiliated with the Islamist movement. But when I asked her why she chose to be an Ennahda candidate, she told me only Ennahda approached her, and she was very much convinced that Ennahda was a well-oiled machine, the Islamist party was a well-oiled machine, and she wanted to observe it from inside. Another surprising candidate was a former military officer in Monastir, a stronghold of the secular movement in the country, and he also told that Ennahda was the only disciplined party. But on the other hand, the candidates in the secular Nida party usually told me how disorganized their party is and how the other candidates actually never contribute to the campaign. basically. So these are all anecdotal evidence, but in this paper, in this presentation, I'm going to try to convince you that there was a systematic difference between the candidate selection practices of these two main parties of Tunisia during 2018. So I will talk a little bit about the concepts of political selection. Then I will try to give you a theory of party-based unequal political selection, how the party practices lead actually to this unequal political selection. I will talk a little bit about the case and the empirical strategy. I will provide my findings, present my findings, and then we are going to talk a little bit about the extensions of this argument. Doing a presentation with a mask on is so difficult. So sorry about that. So basically, when political scientists talk about political selection, they usually talk about politician selection actually, but I mean, it's not a convention to call it political selection. But we are talking about it usually in terms of supply and demand. Some of the voters are supplying themselves, are making themselves available as the eligible aspirants to the parties to become candidates, to become politicians, right? So these are people who are willing to seek office, and they also think that they have political efficacy. They can run in the elections. They can be party activists. They can represent the interests of people. So these are the eligible aspirants, and then the parties in the party-based regimes actually select their candidates from this pool of eligible aspirants. Usually, political scientists talk about the formal candidate selection processes like Gideon and Hazan work, but I think that the more important processes that we should talk about are the informal party selection processes. So this is what I'm going to try to do in this election presentation, not election. I'm not running or anything. Usually, Sweden is given as a case of positive political selection. All the parties, a very important Dalbo and co-authors paper showed us that in Sweden, across the spectrum of political parties, the parties are very successful in selecting the best of the best from, well, that's me, from their voter bases. So all parties are actually very good at undertaking good political selection. But India, for example, is given as a case of negative political selection. So in India, to become a politician, people are arguing that you shouldn't care about your moral credentials because the only way to get things done in India is being a little bit corrupt, basically. And people know this. And this is how they vote for politicians. But I ask what happens if there's an unequal political selection within the same country across parties? Because this is very much understudied. And what leads to these basically unequal political selection. So one party is doing a positive selection, the other party is doing either a negative selection or a relatively negative selection as opposed to the other party. So what happens in these cases? So the sources of unequal political selection might be supply-side explanations. There might be supply-side explanations for that. So maybe competent people on the one side of the cleavage have more incentives to become eligible aspirants. So they, like the competent people in one side of the divide, or for one party, they are making themselves available to become politicians, or competent people on the other side of the cleavage have exit options, or they have disincentives to become a politician. So they disengage from becoming a party politician. So this might be a supply-side explanation of unequal political selection. On the other hand, there might be also demand-side explanations for it, right? So maybe the parties are prioritizing different things than competence of the candidates. To be able to understand this, we should basically understand the party and its incentives, and this is, of course, notoriously difficult to observe for political scientists. What I argue is the party cohesion as an important organizational characteristic has a lot to do with the candidate selection processes. By party cohesion, by organizational cohesion of the parties, I talk about the capability and willingness of the smaller social networks within the party to cooperate effectively. So there is not a very well demarcated factionalism, for instance, or the factions are cooperating with each other. They do not compete with each other. They do not sabotage each other. So the smaller social network, which is a reality of every party, every mass party, they do not very much engage in a degenerative factionalism with each other, basically. So in these cases, in these more cohesive intra-party dynamics, we basically see rules-based, transparent candidate selection methods, which are based on open recruitment, and then the decisions are usually made collectively. But when we have more divided intra-party dynamics, the candidate selection happens very much behind the closed doors through the negotiation of the elites. The candidate selection is left to the whims of the leaders, and they are very fragile and sometimes even violent and chaotic, the candidate selection. Candidate quality also differs between cohesive and divided intra-party dynamics. The competent office seekers are attracted to the party, as I told you in the beginning. It's very surprising. Candidates, very competent candidates can be attracted to the party because they see this as a very able organization. But in the divided organizations, faction leaders actually prefer loyalty to them rather than competence of the candidates. So, with this conceptual and theoretical introduction, I can now present my argument. Basically, I argue that the main secular party in Tunisia suffers from a relatively negative political selection. As opposed to the main Islamist party, its candidates are less competent, despite the fact that the secular voter base in the country actually has a larger share of competent citizens. And I argue that the party-related demand-side factors play a very big role in this. And the reason for this is the fact that the secular party is actually suffering from very intense factionalism, and the party elites prioritize loyalty and connectedness over competence in candidate selection. The empirical strategy I use for this, in this paper, in this presentation, is a detailed comparative description of the candidate recruitment and selection practices and outcomes of the main secular and Islamist parties in the first democratic local elections in Tunisia in 2018. So for the first part of the presentation, I will show you that the candidate pools really differ, and I will also demonstrate the political selection pipelines of both parties through case control design. So I will bring together both data about the candidates and the non-candidates through a contemporaneous household survey and a large-scale candidate survey. And then, after showing that there is a divergence, I will try to explain this divergence by focusing on the incentives and the behaviors of the party elites. And for this, the data is going to come from the interviews with the party elites and a conjoint experiment, again, with the party members. So just to give you a little bit background about the secular-Islamist competition in Tunisia, Ida Tunis is the main secular party. It was founded in 2012, but it actually claims legacy to the secular national liberation movement in the country, which goes back to Bourguiba, Habib Bourguiba, the founder of modern Tunisia. And the historical core constituency of this movement was the urban professional middle class. But since this was a state-building party, since this was a dominant party in the aftermath of independence, it actually incorporated many other social segments like big business or petty bourgeoisie or the rural bourgeoisie. It is an umbrella party. It calls itself as a big house party, Beit Kebir party, and it was suffering from factionalism since 2014, in the aftermath of winning elections, like in the immediate aftermath of the winning elections, basically. And Nafta is Nafta is the main Islamist party. It was founded in 1981 after the revivalism of political Islam globally during the 1970s. It remained underground and in exile during the authoritarian period, which ended in Tunisia in 2011 with the Arab uprisings, with the Arab Spring uprisings. The historical core constituency of this party is usually the campus student movements in the 70s and 80s, the petty bourgeoisie and the new middle classes, which migrated to the Tunisian cities from the rural areas. And since 2000, during the whole democratization period of Tunisia, actually, the Ennahda is in a process of moderation. They are trying to relabel themselves as the Muslim Democrats, and we are going to see the implications of this strategy, of this moderation strategy for candidate selection in a moment. So just to talk a little bit about the first democratic local elections, As I said, this creates a huge drive for party organizational expansion. The important thing which makes it a good opportunity to study political selection, there is no incumbency advantage. At the local level, there was no elected party at the time, so no party was holding incumbency advantage at the local level, and at the national level as well. And NAFTA and NIDA were in a loose coalition with each other, so there was also, like, since both parties were basically in power, there was no incumbency advantage at the national level either. I mean, if there was maybe a slight advantage for NIDA actually, for the secular party, but as we will see, the NIDA is actually the one which is suffering from the relative negative selection. These elections were based on closest proportional representation, and each voter was casting just one vote for a party list, or for an independent list, or for a coalition list. Coalitions are basically parties. The voters were not able to cast a direct vote for the mayor. The mayors were elected in the aftermath of the elections by the council, by the municipal councils themselves. Like in England, like in Britain, basically in the more traditional boroughs of Britain, not in London. So as I said, I'm bringing together the candidate data and the non-candidate data, which is coming from a household survey. The candidate data we collected together with Alex Blackman and Julia Clark. Alex Blackman is actually a PhD from here. She was doing her PhD here when we were collecting the data. She was joining us in many Zoom sessions from Stanford, while Julia and I were in Tunisia. So we conducted a large-scale candidate survey with almost 2,000 candidates in 100 municipalities. As far as I know, this is one of the first candidate surveys in the whole region and in this large scale. And we had candidates, 500 candidates each from NIDA and NAFTA, which gives us an opportunity to compare these candidate pools. And the non-candidate data comes from a contemporaneous household survey, which was conducted by Democracy International, which was also kind of one of our sponsors for the candidate survey. And it actually surveyed almost 7,000 people, and in 73 municipalities, I have data from both candidate survey and the household survey, basically, which gives me this opportunity to do a case control design. So, based on this data, what happens when I basically compare the NIDA candidates to the NAFTA candidates? So this is the first empirical part that I'm going to present. So this is basically a very conservative comparison between the NIDA candidates and the NAFTA candidates. I control for many variables that are affecting the selection of the candidates to the sample or to the list. And I also use municipality fixed effects, cluster Roma standard errors because of the clustered nature of the data collection. So this is a very conservative estimate. But when we look at the differences between the NIDA candidates and the NAFTA candidates, we see that when it comes to individual achievement, the NIDA candidates are actually doing worse than the NAFTA candidates. So they have less organization building skills, they engaged in recent civic action less, they are less educated, although the historical core constituency of the NIDA party is the urban professional middle class. But when we look at the achievement of their families, the families of the NIDA candidates held office more. Their families had more political activism, and actually their parents were more educated. So even though their parents were more educated and more engaged, they are less educated and less engaged basically than the NAFTA candidates, which I think is showing a clear picture of like individual achievement was not very much prioritized by the NIDA elite when they were doing the candidate recruitment. So by bringing the data from the household survey, which is the non-candidates, right? So, and in the household survey, I had a question which asked them whether they were the candidates, so I can also prune them out. And this was a very small percentage anyway. So we can basically have a look at how the voter base transition to eligible aspirants and then the candidates of the main party. For this, though, I have to create a secular Islamist binary variable, basically. And for this, I have the same questions both in the candidate survey and the household survey. which asked them about their stance in the secularism-Islamism debate. And I basically label people who agree with at least two of the three secularism questions, secularism-Islamism questions, as the secular-leaning people and candidates, and the people who agree with the Islamist stance in these questions with at least two of the Islamism statements. I label them as Islamist-leaning citizens and the candidates, basically. So I am recreating kind of the Islamism, secularism binary using the questions in both the household survey and the candidate survey, which are the same questions. So this was good to have these questions in the same way in both surveys. And as you can see, this is the political selection pipeline of the Islamist party. Just to compare it with the secular party. So here you can see there is a gap which is opened between the Islamist party and the secular party in terms of the people with a higher education, which are used as a proxy of competence. And the gap is really opened when the party selection procedures are at play, right? So among the eligible aspirants, the same share of people had higher education, but when it comes to the real candidates, we see there's a 10 percentage point difference in terms of people who have higher education between the Islamist party and the secular party. But there might be potential confounders which affect both being a secular person and being a candidate. And in the current Tunisian society, you might say that having a larger income or having less pro-democratic attitudes might actually be associated with being more secular and also being running as a candidate. Or if you are less pro-democratic, maybe you are less likely to run for candidacy, for being a politician. So we should basically control for these potential confounders. And I do this using a relevance logistic model, which is an extension of the logistic model by Gary King. And it kind of like creates an opportunity to correction for a separate collection of this data, of the candidate data and non-candidate data, and the fact that candidacy is a rare event in the society. So you can even call it that being a politician a rare disease, maybe. So, and here, after controlling for many variables that might be acting as a potential confounder, we see that for secular people and with different specifications of the secular Islamism binary or different specifications of competence in terms of education attainment, you see that for each of these specifications, being more educated actually plays a negative role in your probability to become a candidate. So if you are more educated, you are actually disadvantaged as opposed to the Islamist camp of the society to become a candidate of the secular party. So this shows that, I think these three slides show that there is certainly a disadvantage, a disadvantage of the secular party in political selection. So it faces a relatively negative political selection. How should we make sense of this? How should we try to, and the previous slide also showed that like the party selection processes, because the transition between the eligible aspirants and the candidates, the gap really opens. And it's also basically the parties. I mean, one hypothesis that you infer from that slide is the parties they have different selection practices and strategies. So to be able to understand this, I went to Tunisia, did my field work there prior to the election. So I had like almost 50 interview sessions with Nida and Ennahda and other parties and CSOs, officials, candidates in 8 different cities prior to the election. And then I went back 1 year after the election, and I had some additional interviews as well to have more like a retrospective evaluation of the whole process. So in many different cities, I did this in many different regions of the country, because since these were the first elections, there were no institutionalized practices. So you had to go to different places to see what types of strategies the party offices had in common, basically. So what I saw is, what are the common practices in different local branches of these two parties? In Nida Tunis, we saw that the party elites had consultations with state authorities in the beginning of this candidate selection period. Because they wanted to have the approval of the state authorities, and they wanted to have people who were pointed to them by the state authorities in their lists. So this close connection between the state and party basically made the party to select some incompetent citizens, because like the state authorities, of course, wanted to have very loyalist people in the lists. They didn't have any strategy for outreach to the independents, although these are like each party, if they want to run in all of these municipalities, they had to recruit almost like 10,000 candidates in a country of 11 million people. So that was a huge, I mean, this was basically, this meant that like you have to have a huge drive for campaign for candidate recruitment, but Nida Tunis didn't have a strategy for outreach to the independents. And when I talked to the party people, they said that we actually don't want to have very independent people. We want to have like party loyalists in our lists. But when I asked them whether they were having difficulties in finding competent people, they said yes. So they had many people who wanted to become candidates, but they were having difficulties in finding competent candidates. In many different cities, there were intra-party struggles, and in many cities, this actually led to large-scale resignations. In the case of Nida Tunis, and there was also in many cities there was a lack of cohesion building leadership. So, which is very much related to the previous point. So, the intra-party struggles were the defining element of the candidate selection period. In Ennahda, on the other hand, Ennahda said that we are going to open our lists, 50% of our lists to independent people. So they had a very consistent process of incorporating independents to the lists. And they had an open application process for both member and non-member potential candidates. There was a drive for recruiting surprising independent candidates. I see this in many different parts of the country. Like a Jewish candidate, for instance, in Jerba, in one of the islands in the Mediterranean Sea, or former officers or former bureaucrats who were considered to be less corrupt than the others. And one of the actually, especially in the like more secular parts of the country, since the party is in the phase of moderation, the ideological moderation, the party elites were actually very much proud of these surprising candidates. Like one of the party officials actually was very proud of having the Jewish candidate as a news story in New York Times, and he was bragging about this all the time during the interview. So, and also they had primaries for list ranking, to decide the list ranking, which also makes it a very transparent and rule-based process, basically. One of the women candidates, one of the female candidates, was actually doing her pilgrimage, the Hajj, during the primaries, but she still joined the primary and made her propaganda speech through video link, so through Zoom, basically. And remember, this was in 2018, before the COVID world. So the primaries were also creating this open environment in the party. So the last element that I'm going to present is the candidate selection conjoint experiment. The conjoint experiment is actually a good strategy for this question, because now we are seeing some evidence in the political science literature that it lessens the effects of social desirability bias. Of course, everybody tells you that they want to have non-corrupt people or competent people or like decent people in their list, but well, how do they prioritize between different indicators? All right, so this is actually therefore a good strategy to study candidate selection. We ask them between these two profiles, which one would you reach out first to make them part of your list? And these were the attributes: age, gender, background. And here, CSO experience is important as an indicator of a non-corrupt past. From big family, because there are, especially in rural Tunisia, or I mean, maybe in many parts of Tunisia, not only the rural parts, but like, except the metropolitan Tunis, maybe from big family means like being a conservative family in the city who is kind of representing the status quo. The profession and the party affiliation were the attributes. And here you can see this like whether the party actually has kind of like an opening towards independence or they're just going for the party loyalists. And when we look at the results, you see that so this is the marginal means reported here, which are like the favorability ratings. And I'm showing the difference between the favorability ratings for all of these attributes, NIDA members versus the ENNAHDA members. So this is the difference between the favorability ratings of these two groups, NIDA elite and the ENNAHDA elite. And you see that NIDA had actually a preference for the people from important big families. So the families that represent the status quo in these localities, the conservative status quo, although we are in an aftermath of revolution, and these are the first democratic local elections, and NIDA should be the progressive, the secular progressive part of this country. They do not very much prioritize people with a CSO experience, and when you look at the party affiliation, they really do not want to include any independents to the party. So basically, I mean, NIDA in 2014, NIDA party in 2014 was basically able to distinguish itself from the authoritarian regime, which continued until 2010. But when we came to 2018, these show that like NIDA basically had become more like an authoritarian successor party during the local elections. So many people from the dominant authoritarian party were slowly incorporated back to the NIDA, back to the secular party, and NIDA had lost this differentiation it had established during the 2014 elections from the authoritarian period. Yeah.
Sorry, can you just help me like understand the results here? I'm not entirely sure like what the comparison is, like how do you compute?
So this is basically the difference between how the NIDA members favor these attributes versus how the ENNAHDA members favors these attributes. So this is a difference in marginal means. So basically this tells that like when it comes to from like a candidate from an important family, the NIDA members are 6 percentage point more likely to prefer that candidate as opposed to an ENNAHDA member.
Right. So you do just first do the conjoint independent, like separately.
Yes, and then you.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I showed you that there was a relative negative selection faced by the secular party in the first democratic local elections of Tunisia in 2018. And what can be the extension? And I think I also showed you that this was to a large extent stemming from the fact that the party elites were actually prioritizing loyalty to the factions over competence. They were prioritizing connectedness to the previous status quo, basically. What can the extensions be for the study of political selection? I think we should study the unequal political selection across parties within a country more to be able to understand the political selection practices. We should definitely bring the parties' informal processes to this discussion. In a literature review, which was published in Annual Review of Economics, Dalbo and Finan were saying that like the parties are very much lacking in the discussions of the political selection, and we political scientists certainly know that this is a very important part of political selection, so we should bring definitely parties to this discussion. And I should also say that the software available aspirants can also play a role, whether these people, whether competent people are making themselves available for party activism, can also play a role in the unequal political selection we might see in other contexts and even in this context, basically. For the study of Middle East politics, I think this has some important implications of why secular parties have, we should discuss definitely why secular parties have a disadvantage in organizational cohesion, especially the secular parties. And I talk about these historical parties which claim legacy to the national liberation movements, which are very important in many countries like Istiklal in Morocco, the Republican People's Party in Turkey, or the Left Party in Egypt. So why are they having so much disadvantage in organizational cohesion? Why are they very much characterized by factionalism, by intra-party struggles, by defections, frequent defections? And this unequal political selection will definitely have also implications for the future of the secular Islamist competition in the region. So I think these are also like important issues for future research. Thank you very much. This is the presentation.
Thank you. So any questions, just raise your hand and let me know. So my first question is, you don't talk about party organizational strength in this talk. Instead, it's just about political selection, but I'm wondering if political selection might be a function of something like organizational strength, which is defined in different ways. Scarrow has a definition, Margaret Tavitz has a definition. So have you looked at party attributes like at the national level, financing, professionalization, support from regional partners like other secular and Islamist parties, or programmatic and clientelistic linkages that might affect just the overall strength of these parties on some other dimension aside from candidates?
Should I?
Yeah, you can go.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely different aspects of organizational strength. As you mentioned, like how many members they have, how many local offices they have, whether the local offices are active, whether the membership is active. Right after the 2014 elections, or around the 2014 elections, I don't think these were very different between Ennahda and Nida. But the most important organizational characteristics that I want to emphasize is the cohesion. Like these parties do have support from different segments of the society, but are they able to bring these together in a cohesive way? Or are the smaller social networks are able to work cooperatively with each other, whether there is a collaboration? So I think the most important aspect that I want to emphasize is the organizational cohesion rather than these membership activism or like financing, because I think they are very much related to the cohesion as well. So whether these smaller social networks within the party are basically able to cooperate with each other. So I think like when you say organizational strength, I basically think in terms of cohesion.
Yeah. So my question is picking up on something you said at the end. And one way of putting it is, how would you see political selection operating in a context in which the previous authoritarian regime was Islamist? And the reason I ask is because I'm wondering how much the negative effect you see operating on Nida candidates is due to the authoritarian legacy that they're inheriting, in which presumably they're going to value loyalty, versus how much of the effect is positive selection operating on, I forget the Islamist party's name. How much of it is positive political selection operating on Ennahda due to just various features of like how Islamist parties are organized?
Yeah, I mean, Nida sometimes is considered to be an authoritarian successor party because, again, like towards the end of the 2010s, I think they incorporated more the activists of the RCD, the dominant Islamist part, dominant secular party of the authoritarian era. But I mean, some of the work, like by Jamie Loxton, for instance, also shows that actually being an authoritarian successor party might also have advantages, right? So you have sometimes like selective historical legacy. You can use this legacy. You have like an extensive political organization, extensive territorial organization. Authoritarian legacy might actually be something you can basically use as an asset. But I think what makes the history of Nida problematic for the organizational cohesion is the fact that these patronage all of these networks, which is hosted by the party, are to some extent these patronage networks which were nurtured during the authoritarian state building phase, right? Especially in the Bourguiba phase, when the state building was happening through the party, many different segments of the society were incorporated to the party through the patronage distribution network. So this became basically a way of doing party activism. So you go to the party, you work for the party, and then you demand state privileges, right? You demand public employment, you demand some kind of like discrimination in favor of you when it comes to state auction or something. So basically, this became the way of how people do activism in the secular party, in the main secular party. So the party is very much just like nurturing these patronage distribution networks, because this is how it incorporates activists to each other, and then they very much compete with each other, which is, I think, very problematic for the cohesion perspective. So I think like more like these patronage distribution networks incorporated to the party during the state building phase is more important and creates more disadvantages for the party in terms of cohesion and candidate selection than just being an authoritarian successor party. If the party was able to make this transformation to turn itself into more like a professional party and just like get rid of these patronage distribution networks, I think the authoritarian legacy might actually have played to the favor of them, because there is also like a Benali nostalgia in Tunisia right now. So we were more happy, had a more like an orderly society during the authoritarian era type of thing. So, and like some of the RCD activists are actually really very much liked by their localities. So people are making this differentiation between the activists of the authoritarian era who were corrupt and who were not corrupt. So I'm just to give you an anecdote. Like I went to a city called Secular-Islamist in the southern parts of Tunisia, and they are like, why is Nida so? Why did Nida fail so big time here? I asked many people, and they said, oh, they had RCD activists, they were very corrupt. This was just like all RCD people. But then the next city, just like the neighboring city, Nida did very well. So I asked them, so what is the reason? Why was Nida so successful in this city? And they said, oh, there is a great RCD guy in the head of the list, as the head of the list this time. So I think that this like authoritarian legacy is playing less of a role than people think, but more like the patronage distribution network the party had nurtured during the state building phase, I think is creating problems right now for the cohesion of the party. So the long response. Sorry.
Okay, I have Marcel, Lisa, Hans, and then Marisa. Marcel?
I have two observations. The first one is, I was expecting you to give more detail about what exactly these elected people would do at the local level. I mean, the way you described it, it looks very similar to Belgium. So basically, they would become councillors, and then they would elect the team that would run the locality. Right? So their role is to elect a team of competent people to run the locality. So they may not necessarily need to be competent to elect somebody. That's the first observation. The second observation is that, you know, there were lists with, I don't know, 20 names on them, and most of them would have only 3 or 5 people elected. So you don't need to have 20 people who are clever in that list. You can put your dog in. This person will never be a councillor. So,
Sometimes.
so if you have information on that, where do they stand on lyrics, they will give you an information, you know, that would be a more, because you can have completely incompetent people of the bottom. And the second observation was that you're talking about this cohesion of the party without any reference to civil society. I mean, again, you're thinking about Belgium, where would they be recruiting candidates in different parties? They would have unions, church organizations, not the church itself, church organizations, or actual organizations, professional organizations. These would be basically ponds where they would be recruiting candidates. They would be targeting these people to bring in. I mean, typically you have to convince people to come to the name of it. So I was expecting that you would give us some background why there's another have to rely on family cohesion. I mean, this is probably the lowest level of cohesion we can find in society because there's too many families. It would be better to have something more organized than that.
So I think there are 3 questions. The first is, what exactly do these people do? they only elect the mayor, but they like continue to sit on the council, so they are like still doing stuff, like they come together every week, and they are not like heading commissions, so they are not just like coming together every 6 months just to ask questions to the mayor or the team. So they are still part of the team, basically. So they should be expected to be competent. About the list fillers, you are absolutely right. There can be some list fillers, but when we were doing the sample selection, I didn't mention this during the presentation. When we were doing the sample selection, we basically appointed much higher weights to the people towards the beginning of the list. So we are like our sample is basically more people who were likely to be elected to the council positions, and in the comparisons that I showed between Nida and Nahda, I actually use relative rank as a control, where the person sits in the list as a control, basically. So this is kind of like taken care by the regression. The third question is the civil society. Yeah, I mean, I had some slides about it, but I thought maybe it will be longer. The unions, so it looks like Nida is more selecting people from the big business organizations. They are much more likely to have an affiliation with the big business organizations than the Nahda candidates, although I was kind of expecting to see them more with the professional associations or the civil society organizations, basically, because in the aftermath of the Tunisian revolution, there was kind of like a big revival of the civil society. Like everybody was creating these small associations. They were like trying to contribute to the locality, or they were trying to do some advocacy work with the newly democratic government. But Nida was very much absent when they were like doing this recruitment drive from the professional organizations and the civil society organizations, and which actually shows something. They are kind of like putting a distance between this civil society and themselves. And you can also see at in the last slide I showed that like there was kind of like a almost significant difference between the prioritization of the and after people for CSO, for people with CSO experience, and the preference of the NIDA people. And they were kind of like trying to hire people from these big families. So these family networks are still quite important, especially in smaller cities, smaller towns. And NAFTA, on the other hand, was very much open to the CSO experience, the civil society organization experience, because they see this, I also know from the interviews, they see this just like they can bring in fresh air to us from these CSOs. So I think that the party which was kind of making more linkages to the civil society was NAFTA. So
I think the CSO and CSOs would be like this, right?
No, these are this was a different category in the survey as well, like the more religiously motivated civil society organizations. These new advocacy or social charity organizations people founded after the revolution.
All right, Lisa?
So my apologies if I missed this, but I still don't know why some parties are cohesive and some are not. And you hinted at it in your answer to a question that if the successor party comes from a more ideologically oriented one, maybe we'll have more cohesion, and if it's more clientelist, it will have less cohesion. And then I'm wondering on the Islamist side, is it that your expectation is all Islamist parties will have high levels of social cohesion, or it's contingent? Because you know from the Egyptian experience, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood was highly factionalized in the time leading up to 2011. And this might explain, at least Perry Wickham would say this might explain part of what went wrong. So, what is causing social cohesion? In other words, how do we get the assignment to your main treatment variable? And then second, I'm curious, okay, so let's say there's some kind of candidate selection issue. So what? What happens next? And is the expectation then that if you select bad candidates, that's going to lead to a problem down the line for the success of democracy? Because it seems like what we're observing is a kind of authoritarian or a democratic reversal, maybe some tendencies toward autocratization. And so choosing bad candidates didn't seem to hurt that party, right? And choosing good candidates didn't necessarily help the Islamists over the longer term, but maybe, that's not the right interpretation.
Thank you. These are great questions. So about the what comes, where does the cohesion of the Islamists come from? I'm not sure whether I have any new answer to give to this, because my dissertation was more about the secular parties, to be honest, and I was trying to understand why they lacked organizational cohesion rather than why Islamist parties do have organizational cohesion. And one of the answers that I come up with is because they have these, and I can observe this in Turkey as well, because of these patronage distribution networks are creating these problems for the organization. So I would definitely go back to the big literature on Islamism. What I observed, not a very systematic answer maybe, what I observed is just in the Islamist party, especially in the beginning of this election cycle, this what leads to cohesion is more like we are this identity of trusting each other, basically. The feeling that we have to trust each other, we don't have anybody else than each other in this country to trust, kind of feeling. If we lose power, they are going to send us back to the jail or back to exile, kind of feeling. And we are all in this together, kind of feeling might be leading to more cohesive behavior. This is kind of closer to the Untitled explanation. This identity, common identity, and being able to trust each other and being able to recognize if you see another Islamist type of explanation. But again, my research is more about the seculars. So what is, I think, is a great question. So I think in these elections, I kind of think in the rest of my dissertation, I talk about this, selecting these non-competent candidates definitely hurt me there. And when you talk to people about this, they talk about they selected candidates that we don't know. We cannot accept them. There's no Kabul basically for this candidate. So I think in terms of the electoral chances, it definitely hurt me there in these elections. And in the longer term, actually, when you select these non-competent candidates without any organization building skills, it actually has this dynamic relationship back to organization cohesion. So when you have the non-competent candidates, there's no chance for you to create this better or stronger, more cohesive organization in the long term. And I think it very much showed Nida was in a bad spiral to getting irrelevant. I think it didn't work for the Islamist party, although they had better candidates for different reasons. Kais Said is a big one, of course. So I think that's kind of a different subject. And again, my research is more about secular parties. I don't want to say too much about the Islamist parties. Thank you, though. Great questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Lisa just asked the main question that I had about the consequences of this, but I have two smaller questions I was curious about to hear your thoughts. So maybe I missed it or I misremember it, but I think at some point you said that both Nida and Ennahda draw their support from urban voters. And if that's true, then I was wondering what about rural voters? And maybe one potential reason for why Nida isn't doing this it's because they're trying to recruit from the same pool of voters that is already attached to the Islamist party.
I didn't understand the last part of your.
I'm wondering that if these two main parties try to basically target the same pool of voters and there's not really a party that targets rural voters, maybe that might be one reason why Nida isn't doing as well. But I mean, this is a question from somebody who doesn't know anything about the context. And then my other question is about the definition of negative selection. So if I remember correctly, you have a lot of I think it's very much focused on education, but I was wondering if you could talk more about why we would say that, or why we would think that candidates who are better educated will be better for whichever outcome we're interested in compared to who are less well educated candidates.
I'm starting from the second one. I use education as a proxy of competence in this context. I mean, probably because of the lack of any better candidate. But when we go back to when I do the same exercise in Turkey, I also use the collective orientation of the candidates, and also pro-public motivations also as indicators of quality of the candidate, and we see a similar picture. But in Tunisia, this is very much, this is a little bit lacking, you're right. The core constituency, like the people who formed these parties, were basically kind of like, in the case of NIDA, the urban professional middle classes, which were a new social segment, which were kind of like came into emergence during the mid-20th century. In the case of NIDA, and in the case of Ennahda, it was like the new middle classes who were like migrating to the cities and then like forming a new middle class lives for the historical core constituency of Ennahda. But I mean, the way they just like they were reaching out to new voters changed, and they were both like very much trying to target rural voters as well in the rural parts of the country. Maybe one difference might be how they try to target rural voters. Maybe this is also something I should talk. Again, in the case of NIDA, you kind of like they are trying to mobilize these patronage relationships, patron-client relationships within these rural areas as well. If you take one person from the important families in this area, like people who are kind of like the clients of this big family would vote for us, was the NIDA's strategy as far as I could see. Another strategy was more like creating these more personal relationships with the rural voters. So, but they were both still trying to target rural voters.
Reason. Following up on that, then, so did patronage? So did it, like, you don't need competent people to run patronage directors. You need big families and business leaders, right? They're the ones with the cash. So why did patronage fail to work for them in these rural areas or in these municipal elections?
It didn't fail everywhere. NIDA still got 20% of the vote, and this was kind of like a surprise in these local elections because everybody was thinking like NIDA should be dead by now, and it wasn't. And it actually created a very short revival in the party afterwards. So it didn't fail everywhere. Actually, in some rural areas, NIDA did better than Ennahda because they were having these people. But for the general organization building of the party, it didn't lead to great results. I'm suggesting. So
this idea of like incompetent candidates, everybody widely shared this view that they were less competent. It's not just, you know. How do we know that these candidates, yes, they're less educated, but what evidence were that they actually were incompetent? What made them? Why did this lead to losing the election? Corruption? Is that you gave some anecdotes of people saying, oh, they were corrupt, we voted against them. Why did they lose the?
Again, this very much depends on the people, and you can be sitting in as a head of a patronage distribution network and still be well educated, right? And that you can have like a big acceptance from the people around you. So it is not like we shouldn't make these big claims. What I'm saying is like for the longer term organization building of these parties, selecting like less competent people had a negative impact. So the relationship between the competence of the candidates and the electoral results are not this direct. So this is not what I'm saying.
Just because there's a lot of parties that survived for a long time as organizations built on patronage. So I wouldn't think that just having patronage networks and factions with patronage lead to organizational problems.
Yeah, I actually look at that again in the other paper. Like where does the strategy work and where it doesn't work. In the rural southern areas in Tunisia, it works more basically. But I mean, the northeastern parts of Tunisia is actually quite well developed. And when you look at these areas, like the parties that fail to bring together a cohesive list are more likely to lose votes. So maybe there is a differentiation between different parts of the country. But NIDA was kind of like very much depending on the strategy everywhere, and therefore it was losing votes in some parts of the country. So there might there's definitely differentiation within the country as well.
Sean.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Your research is really fascinating and very engaging. A couple of comments. My first comment is that I'm wondering whether there is a story here to be told about variation in terms of, or stated differently, have you thought about the idea that maybe the causal mechanisms vary by region? Because at least to me, when I think about it intuitively, like, you know, if you're recruiting candidates for people like right next door here in the big urban center where the headquarters are, it's pretty easy to find people to put on the list. Whereas if you're actually kind of like reaching and going into the middle of nowhere, you're obviously like in a position where you need to decide like who counts as a competent candidate, and you tell us a story where maybe that openness towards that broader field of let's find the most competent candidate, or let's find the candidate with the best experience to run. Maybe that's something that applies for a specific set of regions. And I'm wondering whether this is something that you might leverage in your data. I understand that you cluster your standard errors that account for some of these differences, but I'm wondering whether this is something that I want to dig into and explain as opposed to sort of account for in the model. My next broader question, and maybe this is more addressing the implications of your research to a wider set of cases. And by the way, I'm really glad at what you mentioned earlier, that you mentioned that your research is most relevant for secular parties that have that nationalist orientation, that have been involved in national liberation like the Stafleta and the West. That is to say that it may not apply to all of the cases, or all the cases that we nominally categorize as secular in the study of the Middle East and North Africa. But I'm wondering whether even the Islamist secular divide is relevant at all to the story. It sounds to me like this is a clear story about insider politics, outsider politics. The outsider comes in, they're looking for new faces, new people. The insider, I mean, and it's very counterintuitive. That tool is technically on paper, founded in 2012, and Nahda in 1981. But here you find a situation where actually that Tunis is behaving like the incumbent. They're basically looking for the established families, the patronage networks, whereas Nida is much more open to a broader set of you're right. Excuse me, open to a broader set of social forces. So this is part of it, but also the other thing is that story about Nida, and this is really fascinating. It sounds nothing like other Islamist movements in the region. And I'm wondering whether that variation in and of itself is a story to be, something that we need to dig into a little bit, because definitely when I think about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, what you just mentioned, labor union leader running on the list of Nida, I would never imagine something like that happening. Sorry?
Nahda.
Sorry, I'm saying Nida. Sorry, Nahda.
Yeah.
Running for on the Nahda's list, that's something that's just like, for me, is unimaginable when I think about Islamist movements in other places, especially Egypt. So just couple of issues to think about.
I mean, I think I have to probably think more about this variation by the region thing. Thank you for both questions. So again, I do this in the other paper about the effects of the organization cohesion. But maybe I should think more about this in candidate selection as well. How the different families of parties, the implications of this research for the different families of the parties, like the leftist secular parties might be a different family of the parties in the Arab region, and mostly in actually Tunisia and Morocco, in different countries as well. When you think about them, I think the candidate selection practices, I also had a chance to talk to them during this research. The candidate selection practices are more like we should bring our militants to the public front, so they should show that they are also can get things done, type of thing. So rather than kind of trying to find the professional people or more competent people, they are trying to, okay, we have a huge army of the militant young people, So we should basically bring these people to the public and show that like our people can also do something. I'm not sure whether this is a working strategy, to be honest. In the case of Ennahda, I totally agree this was a very interesting strategy, like opening 50% of the candidates, 50% of the list to the independent candidates. And there is some evidence that we are catching actually, again, with the paper with Alex Blackman. This might have actually hurt the party in the longer run, this strategy, because this is kind of like creating a huge army of new people in the party, right? So some people within the party feel like they are being, they have actually were deserving these spots in the lists. So the party is, the top down, the party is bringing this policy, and they have to recruit more independent people. So the party elite, I think in the beginning was very much accepting to this, but when I go back to the country and when I talk to the Ennahda people, I kind of feel like there was some kind of like a regret about this decision. Maybe it should have been like 30%, not 50% type of thing. So this definitely has implications for the current situation of Ennahda as well, because Ennahda is, it now looks like more like a factionalized and divided party. So you're right, it was a really kind of like a rare decision to open up like 50% of the list to independent people, but it probably had like long-term effects on Ennahda as well. One thing to be said is just like this, there is always kind of like a tension between cohesion and opening the party to the new segments thing. Feryal Ocaklı in Turkey, in the case of Turkey, shows that I think quite well. There's definitely a trade-off between incorporation of new people and keeping the party in a cohesive way. And it looks like Ennahda might have failed in this in the current situation. So.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, it seems like some online questions have been answered. Catherine, please.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I thought it was on the list.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
So I have questions that are coming from first Lisa's and then Reese's, and I think also related to Marcel. So a couple of questions. So one is that you present this, and I don't know if this is what you're going to do when you're on the job market. And you started up by saying that the survival of democracy depends on the balance of power between Islamist and secular parties. So this is why we're wondering how what you've described with party selection affects outcome. I'm guessing that's purposeful, right? So I know not a thing about Tunisia except how to spell it. I don't know, so if I were sitting in a job talk, I want you to tell me what the outcomes of the election are at the time to convince me that this is going to matter. Because you made that statement at the beginning, answering the so what question by saying the survival of democracy depends on the balance of power between Islamist and secular parties. Then we don't come back to that. So that's why we're then asking, what's the outcome here that this is affected? Why does this matter? Because you said that's why this matters. So I think that's the basis of these questions, some of them anyway. Because if I took your causality here, voter base from the core constituency to willingness to seek office, to eligible aspirants, to informal, formal candidate selection, to getting to candidates, I would then say from candidates to elections, to losers to winners. That's the natural sort of chain, right? And so we're all kind of assuming that what you're saying is the incoherent patronage-based parties, those candidates lose. But it turns out they don't necessarily, do they? So maybe it's actually they're not being chosen based on the options you gave in the experiment to party leaders. That's not why they're being chosen. You're assuming that they're, so that's my first point. The second point is a separate one, perhaps. You're talking about competence, and I've heard sat here and listened to your answers, and you're assuming it's a competence to govern. What if it's competence to win the election? And so it's not your degree of education, I'm thinking, okay, sorry, Americans in the room. I have American citizenship too, but really? Like congressional candidates are chosen on how well they'll govern so much as whether they can win the election, I mean, that is the utility function of the parties, right? Don't worry, we'll run, we'll govern, right? But can they win? So maybe that's why, choosing someone who has deep ties to important families in particular regions matters more than the level of education, right? Basically, we don't want you mixing with a part of the program, just do what we say. We'll put you on the list. We're much more likely to get a majority if this person from the Trump family or Bush family runs. So maybe you got the utility function of parties wrong, it's making that better.
I don't have much to say, but I just need to think more about this. Just like maybe you're right. In the beginning, I kind of like say that this should be very much relevant to the party's chances to win the elections. Maybe I should make clear that I do not like create a direct link between the competence of the candidates in the way I define them to the electoral results. More like it's more about the longer term organizational evolution of the party important, but maybe I should make it more clear.
Yeah, because I think it's provoking questions that you don't want to answer.
You're right.
Well, if you don't want to make part of this presentation, maybe you want to answer them. Yeah.
Thanks.
Anybody else that I missed? All of you? Okay, well, thank you so much for that excellent talk.
Thank you very much.